Hello, and thank you for clicking on this video. Today we're going to be talking about the Scythian Campaign of Darius the First. But before we begin, I'd like to define asymmetric warfare. Asymmetric warfare is when one side in a battle is much more equipped than the other, and has much more either money or troops, when, just one side is better than the other. So first off, we're going to be talking about the military tactics throughout the war. So, the Scythians had several very unique tactics. Mostly they had guerrilla archers, which really made it a lot easier with the asymmetric warfare. Instead of, having a bunch of soldiers that march together, each archer would be out for themselves, just try to kill as many people as possible. Now, these archers also had poison-tipped arrows. More on that later. And then they also had a tactic that was used later in either World War I or World War II called Scorched Earth, which is now actually banned under the Geneva Convention, which is when they destroy the land, which stops the opposing army from basically getting food from it. Because at the time, an army would have enough food to maybe last them to get to the place that they were going to fight, and then a little bit more. But mostly the food that they ate was from raiding the place that they actually got to. So if you had these nomadic people who moved around and burned all the food that they had every time that they moved, your army would basically be hungry the entire time. And there's a famous quote from Napoleon, "An army travels on its stomach." Now, the Persians were a major power at the time and had a lot of large armies with large upkeeps to match that. And the Scythians were much more tribal. A lot of their tactics and things sort of reflect that as well. And mostly the weapons and things that they used were belonging to the people instead of military funded. So you would be using, like, the bow and arrow that your dad had and his dad had, it's been passed down and such. The Scythians, as I just mentioned, were tribal and only really ever came together for war. They moved around a lot, war or no war, and they rested, hunted, moved on, and which meant that they had no need to really establish an actual building or, any towns or anything, which meant it was a lot harder to take a town that kept moving or simply didn't exist at all. There's a famous quote by one of the Scythian leaders that was chronicled by Herodotus, which was a major Greek historian at the time and one of the only ways that we actually know about this war. And the quote goes as this: "It is thus with me, Persian. I have never fled for any fear of any man, nor do I now flee from you. This that I have done is no new thing, or other than my practice of peace. But as to the reason why I do not straight away fight you, this too I will tell you. For we Scythians have no towns or planted land, that we might meet you on sooner than the battle, fearing lest the one be taken or the other wasted. But if nothing will serve but fighting straightway, we have the graves of our fathers. Come, find these and essay to destroy them. Then shall you know whether we will fight you for those graves or no. Till then, we will not join battle unless we think it good." Which is, again, reflecting on a lot of things I've just said, where they really didn't have any things to protect. They were a nomadic people, meaning that they could really just pick up everything and move on the moment the other army arrived. And this made it extremely hard to track them down during the actual war, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Another one of their tactics that they tried was swarming. And this is when a large amount of troops converge on a single target, and then with the Scythians, they would then barrage them with arrows, and then horse archers would pick off the people who tried to escape. and then more of a dispersed swarming than a mass swarming, where mass swarming is when you have like an entire army converging on a surrounded target, while dispersed swarming is more people here and there coming together to fight a smaller target. Now we'll move on to some more of the Persian tactics, which there aren't that many, because, they kind of worked more like, a standard army at the time, which was, they were built to take towns. They worked, a couple of the sources I was able to find said that they moved in stages, and with that, it was a lot slower, and that this allowed for the Scythians impossible upper hand, because while they were, setting up and doing all these things and marching across fields, they could leave. Well, then I'd also like to make a little side note about the poison-tipped arrows that the Scythians used, which this is a major part of the Scythians' plans, which the poisoned arrows tipped with Scythicon, which is a terrible poison from the time, made of human blood, rotted snake bodies, venom, and feces. The tips of the arrows were shaped like trilobite heads, and that meant that they were very good at piercing armor, which was really all they had to do, because after making a tiny little cut, the poison would take effect, which could lead to tissue necrosis, swelling of the arms and legs, vomiting, convulsions, severe pain, and death. A man named Ovid said that it promised a second death, and in severe late stages it causes gangrene, which is when a part of the body dies separated from the rest. Now we're going to finally talk about the actual war. Now, the majority of this war took place in the area that's now modern-day Russia. Persia planned against the scorched earth tactics that the Scythians used by planning on using the rivers that surrounded the landscape to sort of ship supplies out to where the army would be camped. And so that meant that they didn't have to rely on taking the towns, which put a major dampening on the Scythians' tactics. And then the Scythians withdrew once they realized what was happening, and the scouts declared that Darius's base of operations was merely 3 days from the quote-unquote borders that the Scythians used, because again, they were a nomadic people. I mean, they didn't really have a set area. They moved around a lot, and the women and the children of the Scythians traveled ahead of them in wagons to avoid the conflict. Darius and his army at this time began to make a fortified line to trap the Scythians in a barren area of the landscape that could not support them, and so basically they were planning on trapping them in an enclosed space where their cattle couldn't feed it and it couldn't grow crops. The Persian ships prevented a breakthrough of this fortified line that lined the river. The Scythians made a large circular movement to avoid the Persian trap entirely, and this is a major thing that you see come into play in any war involving the Russian landscape, because it's just so much bigger than any other country that you really don't plan around these huge sweeping movements people can do until they actually happen, and so at this point Darius's plan failed. The Persians reversed, but still the Persians reversed back into Scythia. So the Scythians fled north, and what followed was a grand chase. Finally, after looping northern Europe and Asia, both sides retreat. The Scythians to Scythia and the Persians to a nearby base that they had set up. The Scythians tried to enlist the help of the Greeks, who decided against helping them. What the Scythians had planned was that the Greeks would cut a bridge which would strand Darius's entire army within Scythia as they picked them off and prevented supplies from reaching Darius's army. What happened was the Greeks decided against betraying their Persian leaders, and instead the Scythians enlisted the help of the Ionians, which were another nearby group, What happened is the Ionians were also originally planning on tricking them, but when the second set of the Scythians arrived, the Ionians deconstructed their half of the bridge. Convinced, the Scythians left to go and meet Persia. At this point, the Scythians have to travel back through their scorched earth, and this was something that they were not planning for, and was probably a massive oversight in their plan. What finally happened is the Persians retreated back to Persia, and that ends the Scythian campaign of Darius I. He failed.